Supergirl's a bomb. That's not a hot take. It's not an angle. That is not me yelling the DCU is dead into a microphone because the algorithm demanded another sacrifice. That is settled. Okay, that part's settled. Peter Safran basically admitted it when he told the New York Times that Supergirl didn't meet our box office expectations, which is executive speak for we're not mad. We're just very, very disappointed. And honestly, if you came here for is Supergirl a flop? Congratulations, you're a couple days late. So is everybody else still making that video. What I want to know is the number. Not the number Warner Brothers wants floating around in the trades, not the soft number, not the please stop yelling at DC Studios number. I want the real number. Because the opening weekend was already bad when the first estimate said Supergirl opened at about $68 million worldwide, and then the actuals got worse. Geeks and Gamers and Cosmic Book News both reported the revised numbers at 37.1 million domestic, 25.5 million international, and 62.8 or 62.6 million worldwide. So this didn't just open soft. It got revised downward after the first wave of headlines already went out. And now we have trade coverage suggesting Supergirl could lose around $100 to $125 million. That sounds terrible, but almost survivable. Today, I want to show you why that number may be way too soft if we're talking about theatrical break even. Because once you use the reported production budget, the reported marketing spend, the basic theatrical splits, Supergirl does not look like a $125 million problem. It looks like DC Studios just found out the calculator has a kryptonite setting. Hey everyone, Chris here, the Critical Nerd, and thank you for coming back, those of you that have subscribed. And if you're new here, welcome. Stick around, check this video out, check my other videos out. Around here, we like to keep the expectations low and the receipts high, and we try very, very hard not to let Hollywood accounting do our thinking for us. And today, Hollywood accounting has entered the chat wearing a cape, holding a spreadsheet, and hoping nobody asks why half the costs are missing. Because yes, Supergirl underperformed. No, not just underperformed, it bombed. And yes, the DCU took a body shot. Body blow. And yes, James Gunn and Peter Safran now have to explain why the second big screen movie in their new universe opened like audiences thought it was optional homework. But the more interesting story is not the flop. The flop is the corpse on the floor. The interesting story is who's trying to move the chalk outline. All right, let's start with the basic receipt. The first Sunday estimates had Supergirl opening with about $38 million domestic and $30 million international. They put it roughly around $68 million worldwide. That was already bad. For context, AP reported that Toy Story 5 stayed number one that same weekend with about $70 million domestic, and it had already reached about $585 million worldwide after 2 weeks. So while Pixar was over there printing money with a fifth Toy Story movie, DC's second theatrical entry in the new DCU was opening to $68 million worldwide. Not domestic, worldwide. And then the actuals got worse. According to Geeks and Gamers using Box Office Mojo figures, Supergirl's domestic opening settled at around $37.1 million. International dropped from the estimated $30 million to about $25.5 million. Cosmic Book News reported the same revised split. That pulls the worldwide opening down to roughly $62.6 million. So the story did not improve with the actuals. It deteriorated. And that matters because a movie like this does not just need a decent opening. It needs momentum. It needs word of mouth. It needs the second weekend not to look like the elevator cable got cut. And Supergirl starting from a number where even small downwards revisions are painful. On a $20 million horror movie, a few $1 million is noise. On a major DC Studios theatrical superhero movie with a reported production budget of around $170 million, it might be even higher than that, a few $1 million is a warning light. And that is before we get to marketing. That is before we get to the exhibitor split. That is before we get to the part where the studios does not keep every dollar printed in a box office headline. That is why I do not want to spend 10 minutes asking if Supergirl flopped, because it flopped. Peter Safran said it did not meet expectations. The opening was weak. The actuals were weaker. The audience did not show up in the numbers DC needed. The question now is not, did it flop? The question is, how bad's the damage? And that is where the math starts getting very convenient. So after the opening weekend, the number floating around now is that Supergirl may lose somewhere around $100 to $125 million. Deadline has been cited around that projected loss figure, and Geeks and Gamers also notes Warner Brothers has reportedly argued the movie's break-even point is somewhere around $315 million worldwide, once you factor in things like tax incentives and downstream revenue. And on the surface, that sounds bad, but not apocalyptic. If the movie only needs around $315 million worldwide to get to safety, then maybe the studio can say, okay, rough opening, but if it gets legs, if international stabilizes, if home video helps, if digital rentals kick in, if Max gives it a second life, maybe this is not a crater. Maybe this is just a pothole. That's the soft version. That's the version the studio would much rather have in circulation. Because Supergirl may lose $125 million sounds bad. But, the big but, Supergirl may be hundreds of millions away from theatrical break-even. Sounds like a franchise strategy problem. And those are two very, very different conversations. One is the movie underperformed. The other is, why did DC Studios spend this much money on a character who clearly did not have enough theatrical demand? And that second question is the one nobody in the studio wants to answer. Now, to be fair, downstream revenues do matter. Digital rentals matter. PVOD matters. Streaming value matters. Licensing matters. All of that can reduce the final loss over time. This is not me pretending movies only make money in theaters. But when we are talking about theatrical break even, when we are asking how much box office Supergirl needed to justify itself as a big screen DC Studios release, the $315 million framing does not survive basic math unless you make some very friendly assumptions. And friendly assumptions are how Hollywood turns a fire into some unexpected warmth in the room. Let's start with the cost. The reported production budget is around $170 million. Some reporting places it a little bit higher in the $170 to $186 million range. But I'm going to be generous here. I'm going to use $170 million. Now add marketing. And this is where the number gets uncomfortable. The Times reported that Supergirl's production and marketing budget was around $290 million. That means we're not really talking about a $170 million movie. We're talking about something closer to $290 million studio spend before the movie starts earning its way back. And yes, I know what some people are going to say, but marketing is different. Yeah, it's different, but it's also real. Those trailers did not appear by magic. Those posters did not crawl out of the Phantom Zone. Those TV spots, digital buys, premieres, junkets, interviews, international campaigns, red carpets, press tour moments, and please clap for the new DCU features cost money. Marketing is not imaginary because it makes the spreadsheet ugly. So if we're talking about what Warner Brothers and DC Studios needed this movie to recover, the production budget alone is not the number. The number is closer to production plus marketing. And if that's around $290 million, the bar changes dramatically. Because now Supergirl is not trying to earn back $170 million. It's trying to recover something closer to $290 million in total spend. And that still is not the whole problem. Because worldwide gross is not studio revenue. I'll say that one more time for you guys out in the back. Okay? Worldwide gross is not studio revenue. Warner Brothers does not get to walk into AMC on Monday morning and say, thank you for the ticket sales. We will take all that in a burlap sack marked DC Recovery Fund. Theaters keep a cut. Domestic theaters keep a cut. International theaters keep a cut. The studio keeps less overseas than it does domestically. And if your break-even math does not adjust for that, you're not doing break-even math. You're doing fan fiction with a calculator. A reasonable theatrical split model looks something like this. Domestically, the studio may keep around 50 to 55% of the box office. Internationally, the studio share is usually lower, often closer to 40%, depending on the territory. So, if Supergirl makes $100 million domestic, Warner does not keep $100 million. It may keep around 50 to 55 million. If Supergirl makes 100 million internationally, Warner Brothers does not keep 100 million there either. Maybe it keeps around 40 million. This is the part that breaks the soft math, because 315 million worldwide sounds like a path to recovery only if you treat worldwide gross like studio cash. But it's not. Let's run the simple version here. Say Supergirl somehow gets to 300 million worldwide. I don't see that happening. Already based on that 62.6 million worldwide opening, that would require legs this movie has not yet earned. But let's be generous. Let's say it gets there somehow. If the final split is roughly half domestic and half international, and the studio keeps maybe 55% domestic and 40% international, the blended studio return is somewhere in the high 40s. Let's call it roughly 47 to 49%. That means a $300 million worldwide gross does not give Warner Brothers $300 million. It gives them something closer to 140 to 150 million in theatrical rentals, against a total reported spend of around 290 million. So at 300 million worldwide, Supergirl's not breaking even theatrically. It is still massively short. Now push it to 400 million worldwide. At high 40s blended studio share, maybe the studio gets around 190 million back theatrically. Still short. Push it to 500 million. Now maybe you're around 235 to 245 million in theatrical rentals. Still not clean if your total cost basis is around 290 million. That is why the real theatrical break-even conversation is not 300 million. It's much closer to 580 to 600 million dollar range. Because 290 million divided by a high 40 studio retention rate gets you right into that neighborhood. It's not complicated math. That is not secret Hollywood accounting. That is just remembering the studio does not own every dollar in the headline. And this is why I've been using the $550 to $600 million framework for Supergirl, as well as others. If marketing is lower, if tax credits are better, if downstream revenue is stronger, you can soften that final loss, which, fine. But if we're asking what the box office number actually makes this thing safe theatrically, $315 million is not safety. It's a much nicer looking coffin. All right, let's talk about that projected loss number that's floating around. You know, that roughly $100 to $125 million? That may be possible if you're already crediting downstream revenue, tax incentives, and a very friendly post-theatrical recovery. And again, not doubting this, in its fact that downstream revenue is real. A movie can lose theatrically and still claw back money later. Saying it can't. But there's a difference between this movie may eventually reduce its studio loss after home entertainment, streaming valuation, licensing, and other revenue streams, and this movie was anywhere close to breaking even at the box office. Those aren't the same statement. And this is where the framing matters. Because if the public hears Supergirl might lose 125 million, the reaction is, it's bad, but we've seen worse. Now, if the public hears Supergirl needed somewhere around $580 to $600 million worldwide to get close to theatrical safety, and it opened to 62.6 million worldwide after actuals, that is a completely different conversation. Because then you're not talking about one disappointing opening, you're talking about a broken demand model. You're talking about DC Studios spending like the audience trust problem was already fixed. You're talking about a movie that needed blockbuster confidence but opened like a brand still on probation. And that is the part the soft math hides. I'm going to use a rough example here for you. If Supergirl finishes under 200 million worldwide, which is very possible from this opening unless something drastic changes, then the theatrical return could be under $100 million to the studio, depending on the domestic and international split. Against a roughly $290 million production budget plus marketing spend, that is a theatrical gap approaching $200 million before downstream revenue. Now, can streaming and digital reduce that? Yeah. Can tax incentives reduce exposure? Yeah. Can studio accounting move pieces around? Yeah. This is Hollywood. They can make $1 billion movie look poor and a corpse look like it's just resting. But that does not change the theatrical reality. The box office is not remotely close to what this movie needed. And that is the point. The $125 million loss number is not necessarily fake, but it is not the clean theatrical break-even story either. It is a softened, all-in projection that depends on revenue streams audiences do not see and assumptions the studio would very much like you not to question. And when someone says, Supergirl only needs $315 million to break even, the response should be, break even where? At the box office? No. After downstream? Maybe if you're extremely generous. After tax credits and accounting assumptions? Possibly. But theatrically? It's not even close. Now there's another detail that has been floated in some coverage. Supergirl reportedly does not have the same kind of expensive first dollar gross talent deals that hurt movies like Joker 2, where major stars had rich participation deals. The implication is Supergirl's break-even point is lower because there's less back-end eating into the studio's take. And sure, that helps at the profit stage, but here's the problem. Back-end participation affects what happens after the studio starts getting whole. It does not magically eliminate production cost. It does not erase marketing. It does not make theaters hand Warner Brothers 100% of the ticket money. It does not turn $62.6 million worldwide into $150 million of studio revenue. If Millie Alcock does not have a giant first dollar gross deal, that means less money is carved out later. Fine. That is good for the studio compared to a movie loaded with expensive back end. But it does not change the basic reality that Warner Brothers still had to pay to make the movie, pay to market the movie, and split the box office with exhibitors. You cannot use no massive back end as a magic eraser for front end spend. That is like saying, good news, the boat's still sinking, but nobody charges extra for the anchor. Wonderful. We're still wet. This whole conversation's bigger than Supergirl, and this is why the math matters. Because Supergirl was not just a random one-off superhero movie. This was the second big screen release for the new DCU. Superman was supposed to restore confidence. Supergirl was supposed to prove that confidence could transfer. And there's the key word. Transfer. It's one thing to get people to show up for Superman. He's Superman. He's one of the most recognizable fictional characters on Earth. He has the cape, the shield, the theme, the mythology, the nostalgia, the entire DC identity on his back. But Supergirl was the real test. Could this new DCU take goodwill from Superman and use it to sell a riskier, weirder, less proven character? Could audiences be convinced that this universe was now appointment viewing? Could DC Studios make people feel like skipping Supergirl meant missing a chapter? The opening weekend says no, or at least not yet. And that is a problem because the DCU slate is not just Batman and Superman every 6 months. You've got Lanterns, Clayface, Swamp Thing. The Brave and the Bold, whenever that finally or eventually comes out, if it hasn't been canceled yet. You got whatever is going to happen with Wonder Woman. It's a universe, and universes require trust. They require audiences to believe the next thing matters. Marvel used to have that. Star Wars used to have that. Disney used to have that across the board. And now Hollywood keeps learning the same lesson in the most expensive way possible. Brand recognition is not the same thing as urgency. Supergirl had brand recognition. It had the DC label. It had the Superman adjacency. It had James Gunn's universe around it. It had crypto. It had the media push. It had the whole new DCU framing. And it's still open to 62.6 million worldwide after actuals. So when the studio tries to soften the math, that is not just about protecting one movie. It's about protecting the perception of the plan. Because if Supergirl is just a $125 million problem, maybe the plan survives with a shrug. But if Supergirl is a $580 to $600 million theatrical break-even problem that opened at 62.6 million worldwide, now we're asking a much more uncomfortable question. How much trust did Superman actually rebuild? And did DC Studios mistake online enthusiasm for ticket buying intent? This is also where the trade press deserves scrutiny. Not because every trade reporter is lying. That's lazy. And it's not the argument. The issue is that studios use trades to set expectations. They use trades to define the acceptable version of reality. Before release, they manage tracking. After release, they manage blame. After a flop, they manage losses. And if they can get a softer break-even number into the bloodstream, that number becomes the number everyone repeats. Then suddenly the conversation is not, how did a $290 million studio spend open to $62.6 million worldwide? It becomes, well, maybe it only loses $125 million. See how much nicer that sounds? Still bad, but much less catastrophic. That is the power of framing. You do not need to make the movie look successful. You just need to make the failure look contained. And that is what I think is happening here. Supergirl did not merely miss expectations. The opening was soft. The actuals were revised downward. The international got worse. The reported cost basis is too high. The theatrical split makes the recovery path brutal. And the broader DCU implication is obvious. The audience is not automatically following this universe just because the studio says Chapter 1 has begun. That is the real story. Not Supergirl's a flop. I mean, again, it's settled. The real story is, how much money did this movie actually need to make before Warner Brothers could honestly call it safe? And the answer is not $300 million. The answer is not $315 million. Not theatrically. The honest theatrical number is much closer to $600 million, which means Supergirl did not just stumble. It opened at barely over 10% of the worldwide gross it likely needed to be comfortable as a theatrical investment. That's not a rough start. That is a flashing red light. So before I wrap this up, I got to give a shout out to Chris Gore. If you're not following him on X, if you're not subscribed to Film Threat, you got to do both. This here is from the AMC Theater in, I believe it was Burbank. The day, I think it was Monday or Tuesday, Chris Gore happened to notice them tearing down the Supergirl display and throwing it away. So just had to throw that in there. So the bottom line, Supergirl's not a bomb because YouTubers said it's a bomb. Supergirl's not a bomb because fans were mean. Supergirl's not a bomb because the internet was unfair. Supergirl is a bomb because the numbers say it's a bomb. The studio expected more. Peter Safran admitted it did not meet expectations. The first estimate was weak. The actuals got worse. The domestic number settled around 37.1 million. The international number dropped to about 25.5 million. The worldwide opening landed at about 62.6 million. And when you compare that to a reported production plus marketing spend around $290 million, the soft break-even framing starts to look less like math and more like damage control. Again, downstream revenue can reduce the final loss. Tax incentives can help, accounting can soften the blow, but the theatrical math is brutal. A movie with that cost basis does not need $300 million worldwide to be healthy. It needs something closer to $580 to $600 million. And Supergirl opened like a movie that may struggle to reach half of the soft number, let alone the real one. That is the part no headline can spin away. The flop is old news. The break-even math is the story. And the receipt is simple. Supergirl did not just fail to fly, it failed the calculator. Keep your expectations low and your receipts high. Let me know what you think in the comments. Is the $125 million loss projection realistic once downstream revenue is included? Or is the theatrical gap much uglier than the trades want to admit? And if you want the full breakdown of what this means for James Gunn's DCU going forward, do me a favor, hit like, subscribe, ring the bell, and I will see you in the next one.